Yeah, and obviously that's kind of the reason why we're having this conversation, isn't it? To get the dialogue going, to put stuff out there. Um, a couple of really interesting points you brought up there. I just want to have a look at. Procurement is in a quite a unique position in the way that it touches so many different functions within an organization. But I think it's also in a very interesting position in the sense that has access to and is a kind of a fulcrum for a lot of different data sets and data points. And one of those is the internal versus external balance that you talked about. I find that particularly fascinating. As you said, we can talk in a minute about your crossover to the consulting world from kind of practice in house. Um, but that's quite a unique viewpoint, really, isn't it? To be able to see what's happening within the organization and how the organization views their external kind of suppliers, which if it's delivering goods, that's fundamental to their business. If they're delivering services, they're almost like extended capacity of the organization. But to get a view of what's happening internally and what the internal stakeholders think of the external suppliers, supply chain, and the other way round, I think that's a really unique viewpoint. Just being able to see, well, we don't want to operate in a vacuum. As a business, what are other organizations that are doing clever, cool stuff? What do they think of what we're doing? And like you say, that kind of innovation and creativity, that's the sexy part of it, really, isn't it?
Yeah. So whether you're a procurement category manager, category director, or your process center of excellence, your goal is to be data driven. You need to have all the data. So when you start to build a performance management framework, you start with basic KPIs, and you see deviations from these KPIs. The same when you gather data from external benchmark and from internal sources, and you compare them. You start with the basics, and then you start to find opportunities of improvement or opportunities in the market. But very quickly, you will reach a limit because you don't necessarily know what is the business process behind the data. So you need to dig constantly to try to explain what is happening behind it. For example, I remember we're implementing some processes, and we look at the ledgers. And we see some reversal transactions, and we're absolutely not understanding what was happening. That was skewing one KPI. So we had to go to the bottom of it. And we understood that it was substitution, that you receive a product without a purpose for it. And then 6 months later, when you sell it, in telco, you have prepaid and postpaid. You suddenly assign it a purpose. And this purpose has a very different financial meaning, whether it's prepaid and postpaid. So you had the kind of reversal, then rebooking of the same transaction. That's an example of how deep you can dig into the data and really understand what is the business process behind. I discovered processes I had no idea were existing. Consignment, substitution items, exchange rate variance. When you look at accounting in Europe, exchange rate variance, you ask, most of the people don't really know what it is. But in Southeast Asia, where you have a lot of variance in the currency, the impact on the P&L is actually enormous. So they book it, and they're very, very rigorous in calculating it. So yeah, it's just, you look at the data, you need to dig, you need to find what is the root cause, what is the root process behind it. And I find this really captivating. I'm coding since I'm 10 years old, and that's what I always loved when I was coding, is that you need to find what's wrong in your code, right? You need to dig, you need to grind, kind of. And that's exactly what procurement gives you. It gives you the opportunity to understand so many processes in very deep details and to improve efficiency one process at a time.
Yeah, that is quite like coding, really, isn't it? In terms of the creativity of seeing an overall architecture, a developer being able to see an overall architecture in their head of where they want to get to, what fits where, how you can add new processes in without destroying old processes, without making the whole thing totally inefficient. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of angle to view it.
It's really a process, and to put it, I've talked a lot about performance management, but to put it more in a category management perspective, when you go in front of the top leaders of your organization and you're going to push for a spend of, let's say, $200 million, this is enormous amount. There's enormous pressure to find the right vendor, to make sure that you have the scope right, that all the terms of the contract are right. There's so many different elements in it, right? And that you can only do it if you have an efficient data processing behind, because you need to have the right data. You have no idea what the management will ask you, but they will ask you, okay, this sub-vendor, do we have existing spend with them? How much do we spend for the whole group? And suddenly everyone is panicked. We don't know, right? You cannot know everything, of course, but that's where procurement digitalization takes place. It's in facilitating the access to all kind of data that would answer all kind of questions. When top management sees that you have answer and data-driven answers to these kind of very specific questions, the trust is much stronger. And therefore you get more autonomy in driving your projects. Yeah.